She was a mother fighting to survive. He was a man who had everything except love. When a desperate single mother crosses paths with a cold-hearted billionaire, neither of them expect their worlds to collide. But one fateful night changes everything. A lost wallet, a life-altering decision, a debt that can never be repaid. As secrets unravel and past wounds resurface, they are forced to face the truth. Some people enter your life not to save you, but to change you forever. Will love be enough to heal the scars of betrayal? Or will fear drive them apart before they even have a chance? Betrayal, redemption, a love story born from the impossible. Subscribe to our channel now and get ready for an emotional roller coaster you won't forget. Subscribe now. The cold rain pelted down relentlessly, soaking the city streets of New York. The wind howled through the alleys, cutting through Emily's thin, worn-out jacket like a blade. She huddled under the awning of a closed convenience store, pulling Lily and Rose close to her, shielding them as best as she could from the biting chill. Lily whimpered, her small body trembling against Emily's chest. The fever had worsened, her forehead burned against her mother's touch, but her tiny fingers were ice cold. Rose, too exhausted to fight against the night's misery, had drifted off to sleep in Emily's lap, her breath shallow and uneven. Emily clenched her teeth to stop them from chattering. Her arms ached from holding her daughters for hours, her legs numb from sitting on the cold pavement. She wanted to cry, but tears felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. What kind of mother lets her children suffer like this? What kind of mother fails to give them even the basic warmth of a home? Her stomach twisted in hunger, but she ignored it. Lily needed medicine. Rose needed food, and she had nothing. No money, no shelter, no hope. Just as she was about to close her eyes and let the night swallow them whole, a figure stepped out of a cafe across the street. The warm, golden light from inside spilled onto the pavement, contrasting starkly with the darkness around her. The man adjusted the lapels of his tailored coat, the rain sliding off the expensive fabric without leaving a trace. His dark hair was slicked back, his face composed, sharp, unreadable. In one hand, he held a steaming cup of cappuccino, the scent of rich coffee momentarily cutting through the stench of the wet city. With his other hand, he reached for his car keys. Emily barely paid attention. She was used to the sight of the wealthy passing by, their lives untouched by the struggles of people like her. But then, something happened. A gust of wind howled through the street, and in that moment, a black leather wallet slipped from the man's pocket and tumbled onto the wet pavement, landing just inches from Emily's feet. She stared at it. For a second, everything else faded. The rain, the hunger, the cold. Inside that wallet, there was money. Enough to buy food, enough to get a warm bed for her daughters. Maybe even enough for Lily's medicine. Her fingers twitched. She glanced up at the man. He hadn't noticed. He was too busy unlocking his luxury car, oblivious to the fact that his wallet was now lying in the hands of fate. Emily swallowed hard. What was she supposed to do? Emily stared at the wallet lying at her feet. The rain had darkened the leather, tiny droplets clinging to its smooth surface. Her fingers trembled as she reached down, picking it up with slow, deliberate movements. It felt heavy in her hands, not just in weight, but in significance. Inside, there could be enough money to feed Rose for days, enough to buy medicine for Lily, enough to find a warm, safe place for them to sleep, even if just for one night. Her chest tightened as she imagined it, walking into a store, buying a fresh meal, hearing Lily sigh in relief as the fever medicine kicked in. She could picture Rose's face lighting up at the taste of warm food. The thought alone made her breath hitch. But then reality crashed back. This wasn't her money. It belonged to the man now stepping into his sleek black car, completely unaware that he had lost it. A man who, judging by the way he dressed and the car he drove, wouldn't even notice if a few bills went missing. Would he really suffer if she kept it? Her grip on the wallet tightened. She had spent months trying to hold on to the last shreds of her dignity, teaching her daughters about honesty, about doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. But now, when it truly mattered, could she still follow those values? Could she still be the mother she wanted to be? A gust of wind sent another chill through her soaked clothes. Lily whimpered softly, stirring in her arms, her feverish body seeking warmth. That sound shattered any hesitation left inside Emily. No, she couldn't steal. Even if it hurt, even if she had nothing, she wouldn't take what wasn't hers. She couldn't look her daughters in the eye if she did. Emily sucked in a shaky breath, then, gathering every ounce of strength left in her, she pushed herself up to her feet. Her legs wobbled, the hunger and exhaustion threatening to pull her back down. But she forced herself forward. "Wait," she called out, her voice barely rising above the sound of the rain. The man paused, one hand on his car door, before turning his head slightly. Emily stumbled forward, her breath hitching as she hurried toward him, clutching the wallet tightly. "You dropped this," she said, her voice hoarse from the cold. She held it out to him, her hands trembling from both exhaustion and the weight of what she was giving up. For a moment, Peter Carter simply stared at her, his sharp eyes flicking between the wallet and her face. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers, warm, strong, steady. Emily swallowed hard. She had done the right thing. So why did it feel like she had just lost her last chance at saving her children? Peter stared at the wallet in his hand, then back at the woman standing in front of him. Rain dripped from her tangled hair, her clothes clinging to her thin frame. But despite her clear exhaustion, there was something steady in her gaze. He flipped open the wallet instinctively. Everything was there. His cash, credit cards, Idaho, not a single dollar missing. That surprised him. People weren't usually this honest, especially not those who looked as desperate as she did. He had seen enough of the world to know that money was temptation. Yet here she was, returning what could have been her way out. His sharp eyes assessed her, pale skin, dark circles under her eyes. The protective way she held her arms around the frail little girl beside her. The child's face was flushed with fever, her tiny body wrapped in nothing but a damp sweater. Something about the sight made his chest tighten. Still, Peter wasn't the type to trust easily. He had been deceived before. People always had motives. He closed the wallet and asked, voice calm but firm, "Do you need money?" Emily's body stiffened slightly. For a brief second, something flickered in her eyes. Pain, pride, something else he couldn't quite read. Then she straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin just a little as if summoning what little dignity she had left. "I just need a job." That answer caught Peter off guard. Most people in her situation would have immediately said yes. They would have pleaded, begged, maybe even demanded something in return for their honesty. But she hadn't. She had returned the wallet without expecting anything. And now, instead of asking for money, she was asking for work. Peter studied her for a long moment, his mind analyzing the situation the way he did in business deals, calculating risks, assessing potential. He wasn't sure what to make of her yet. Finally, he slipped the wallet back into his coat pocket. His voice remained cool, unreadable. "Is that so?" Emily nodded once, firm. Something about her answer intrigued him, but trust was not something he gave easily, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to believe in her just yet. Peter hadn't planned to get involved. He never did. But as he looked at the little girl beside Emily, her cheeks flushed with fever, her small body shivering under the weight of the cold, something in his chest twisted in a way he didn't expect. Lily swayed slightly, her tiny hands gripping onto her mother's coat for balance. Her eyelids fluttered, as if she was on the verge of collapsing. Peter let out a slow breath, rubbing his thumb against the edge of his wallet. He had no intention of making impulsive decisions, but right now this wasn't business. This was a child, barely clinging to consciousness, while her mother stood frozen, helpless, drenched from the rain. His fingers tightened briefly around the leather in his pocket before he spoke. "Come inside. Have a meal." Emily blinked up at him, startled. He saw the hesitation flicker in her expression, the immediate instinct to refuse. She started, but before she could protest, Lily let out a soft whimper, her legs buckling beneath her. Emily reacted instantly, catching her daughter before she could hit the ground. That was enough for Peter. "I'm not asking," he said, stepping forward. His voice was quieter this time but firm. She needs warmth and food. Emily swallowed hard. He wasn't wrong. Lily's fever was only getting worse. She couldn't afford to refuse. Not now. Still, something about accepting help from this man, a complete stranger, felt terrifying. She had spent so long trying to survive on her own, depending on no one. But this wasn't about her. This was about Lily. Emily hesitated only a second longer before nodding. Okay. Peter gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return. Then, without another word, he turned and started walking toward the restaurant, trusting that she would follow. Emily adjusted her grip on Lily, her heart pounding as she took the first step inside. She had no idea what she was walking into, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't completely alone. The warmth of the restaurant was an almost overwhelming contrast to the bitter cold outside. The soft glow of the dimmed lights cast a golden hue over the polished wooden tables, the quiet hum of conversation blending with the clinking of silverware. The rich aroma of fresh bread and simmering soup filled the air, making Emily's stomach twist with hunger she had long learned to ignore. She sat stiffly across from Peter in a corner booth. Lily curled against her side, still weak but comforted by the warmth. Rose sat beside her sister, her wide eyes darting curiously around the elegant restaurant, as if she had stepped into a completely different world. A waiter appeared, placing bowls of steaming soup in front of them. The scent of roasted vegetables and tender chicken hit Emily all at once, and she instinctively pulled the bowls closer to her daughters. Her hands moving before her brain even registered it. Peter noticed. She hadn't touched her own food yet. Her only concern was making sure her children ate first. Lily, despite her exhaustion, gave a small, polite, "Thank you," before lifting the spoon to her lips. Rose followed, her excitement barely contained as she eagerly took her first bite. Peter leaned back in his seat, watching quietly. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe desperation? Maybe a woman who would throw herself at the food, who would take advantage of his offer without hesitation. Instead, he saw something else entirely. He saw control, discipline, a quiet strength beneath the surface. She wasn't reckless or entitled. She was simply a mother. "You don't have to just sit there," he said, his voice calm but pointed. "Eat." Emily hesitated, then nodded slightly before picking up her spoon. She sipped carefully, as if reminding herself how to savor a warm meal again. For a while, they ate in silence. Peter had never been one for small talk, and Emily seemed too guarded to start a conversation herself. But then, as she gently wiped the corners of Rose's mouth with a napkin, she glanced up at him. "I should thank you," she said softly, "for this." Peter simply gave a small shrug, reaching for his glass of wine. "It's just a meal. For you, maybe," she murmured, lowering her gaze. "For us, it's the first warm food we've had in days." Peter's hand stilled slightly around the stem of the glass. Something about the way she said it, not with self-pity, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a simple, honest statement, made something shift inside him. After a pause, he set his glass down. "Where's their father?" Emily tensed. For a moment, Peter thought she might not answer, but then she exhaled slowly, staring down at her soup. "He left," she said, her voice carefully measured. "We had a life together once, a home, stability. Then one day he decided he wanted something else. Someone else." Peter didn't move, but his jaw clenched slightly. Emily's fingers absently stroked Rose's hair as she continued. "He drained our savings account, took what he wanted, and walked away. And just like that, we had nothing." Her words hung in the air, matter of fact, but laced with a quiet pain. Peter knew betrayal. He had seen it, felt it. And though his situation had been different, he understood one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing ruins a person quite like being abandoned by the one who was supposed to stay. For the first time, he found himself looking at Emily not as a stranger, not as a woman desperate for help, but as someone who had been burned by life in a way he could recognize. Still, he remained silent, swirling the wine in his glass, maintaining that careful distance he always did. Emily glanced up at him then, studying his unreadable expression. "What about you?" she asked. Peter raised a brow. "What about me?" "You don't wear a ring." Her voice was quiet, but perceptive. "A man like you, wealthy, well-dressed, obviously successful. I'd assume there's someone waiting for you at home." Peter's lips curved slightly, but it wasn't amusement. It was something closer to cynicism. "No one waits for me," he said simply. Something flickered in Emily's eyes at that. Recognition, maybe even understanding. She didn't press him further, and he was grateful for that. Instead, she turned her attention back to Lily, brushing damp strands of hair from the little girl's forehead, her touch so full of warmth and care that Peter had to look away. He wasn't sure why, but something about the way she did that, so natural, so effortless, made him feel like an outsider to something he couldn't quite name. And for the first time in a very long while, he wasn't sure if he liked that feeling. Lily had barely touched her food. Despite Emily's gentle coaxing, despite the warmth of the soup and the softness of the bread, her little hands had grown too weak to hold the spoon. Her eyelids fluttered, her breath shallow and uneven. Emily reached for her daughter, pressing a hand to her forehead, and her heart clenched. The fever was rising again. "Lily," she whispered, her voice tight with worry. "Baby, stay awake, okay?" Lily's head lolled slightly, her small body slumping against Emily's arm. Peter, who had been watching in silence, set his glass down with a quiet clink. "She needs proper rest," he said, his voice calm but firm. Emily didn't respond immediately. She knew that. She had known that since the moment she first felt the heat radiating from Lily's skin. But knowing didn't change the fact that they had nowhere to go. She pulled Lily closer, trying to offer what little warmth she could, and looked toward the restaurant doors. The rain outside hadn't stopped. The cold would be worse now, sinking deeper into their already weakened bodies. Her mind raced. Maybe she could find another shelter, beg for a space just for the night. Maybe she could... "You can't take her back out there!" Peter's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Emily turned her head sharply, her defenses instinctively rising at his tone. But Peter wasn't looking at her with pity. He wasn't offering charity. He was making a statement. A fact, not a suggestion. "Come with me," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen before glancing back at her. "I have space. You can stay for the night." Emily stiffened. She had accepted the meal because she had no other choice. But this? Going to his home? Accepting his shelter? Everything inside her screamed against it. "No, you don't take help from people like him." Rich men didn't give without expecting something in return. Her arms tightened around Lily as she shook her head. "I appreciate what you've done, but we'll be fine." Peter's expression remained unreadable. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his fingers loosely interlocked. "No," he said, "you won't." The bluntness of it sent a flare of irritation through her, but before she could snap back, Lily let out a weak cough, curling into Emily's chest. Peter sighed, running a hand through his hair. His patience was wearing thin, and he wasn't the kind of man who repeated himself. "Look," he said, voice quieter now, but still holding that sharp edge of authority. "I don't know you, and you don't know me, but I do know that if you walk out that door with her in this state, she's not going to last the night in the cold." Emily's nails dug into the fabric of her sleeves. She hated that he was right. She hated that she couldn't argue. She hated that she was out of options. Her pride had already taken enough of a beating tonight. But it wasn't about her. It was about Lily. And Lily couldn't survive on pride alone. Emily swallowed hard, then nodded. Just once. "Fine," she whispered. Peter exhaled, pushing back from the table. "Let's go." He didn't wait for her to change her mind. He simply stood, pulled out his wallet, and dropped enough cash on the table to cover the untouched food. Emily adjusted her grip on Lily, lifting her carefully before rising to her feet. Rose clung to her mother's coat, eyes darting nervously between Emily and Peter, sensing the shift in the air. Peter led the way out of the restaurant. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, the cold still biting but no longer unforgiving. A sleek, black car was waiting at the curb. Emily hesitated again at the sight of it, but Peter simply opened the door, gesturing for her to get in. She cast one last look at the street, at the only life she had known for the past year. Then she stepped inside. Peter never considered himself a sentimental man. His life was built on structure, on calculated risks and meticulous control. He didn't let emotions dictate his decisions, and he certainly didn't bring strangers into his home on impulse. But here he was, seated in his dimly lit study, a crystal tumbler of whiskey in his hand. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the security monitor in front of him. His estate was lined with cameras, not because he was paranoid, but because he believed in protecting what was his. Over the years, he had made enough enemies in business to know that trust was a fragile commodity. And now, inside the very walls of his home, was a woman he didn't know. His original intent had been simple: keep an eye on her. Not because he believed she was dangerous, but because experience had taught him that desperation could make people unpredictable. Yet as he watched the grainy black and white footage, something unexpected happened. Emily wasn't behaving like someone who had just struck gold. She didn't rummage through the expensive furniture. She didn't inspect the valuables in the main hall or peek into any of the rooms she wasn't meant to enter. Instead, she sat on the couch in the guest room, her arms wrapped tightly around Lily, rocking her gently as she hummed a soft lullaby. Peter tilted his head slightly, his grip on the tumbler loosening. Lily stirred in her mother's embrace, shifting with a quiet murmur. Emily instantly pressed a hand to her forehead, her brows furrowing in concern. Even through the low-quality footage, Peter could see it, the exhaustion in her posture, the worry etched into every fiber of her being. She was running on empty, but she refused to rest until she was sure her child was safe. Something in Peter's chest tightened. He switched to another camera feed. Rose was curled up in the large bed, too small for its vastness, but already fast asleep. Emily had taken the extra blanket from the closet and tucked it securely around her little body, making sure she was warm. Then, after checking Lily one last time, Emily stood. Peter watched as she glanced around the unfamiliar space, her movements careful, hesitant. She didn't touch anything unnecessary. Instead, she walked to the ensuite bathroom, grabbed a damp washcloth, and returned to kneel beside the couch where Lily lay. Gently, she wiped the sweat from her daughter's forehead, murmuring soft reassurances as she did. Peter exhaled slowly, resting his elbow on the desk and pressing his fingers against his temple. This was different. He had seen people take advantage of kindness before. He had seen gratitude twisted into expectation, honesty faked for personal gain. But Emily wasn't behaving like someone who was waiting to be saved. She was behaving like someone who had spent her entire life saving others. And she was doing it alone. Peter wasn't sure why, but that realization made something shift inside him. He reached for his whiskey, swirling the liquid idly before taking a slow sip. Maybe he had been wrong about her. Maybe, for the first time in a long time, he had met someone who wasn't looking at him for what he could offer, but simply for who he was. And that thought unsettled him more than anything else. Peter hadn't intended to keep watching. After that first night, he had told himself that his curiosity had been satisfied. Emily wasn't a thief. She wasn't here to take advantage of him. That should have been enough. And yet, every evening after work, he found himself drawn back to the screen, eyes scanning through the different camera feeds, telling himself it was just routine security. But that was a lie, because what he saw on those screens did something to him. The first time it was simple. Emily was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing the counters. Peter frowned. She wasn't expected to clean. The house was maintained by staff, people who were paid well to ensure everything remained spotless. But here she was, wiping down surfaces, washing the dishes that she and her children had used, moving quietly but efficiently. She wasn't just tidying up after herself. She was making sure no one could say she didn't belong here. The second time, it was something else. Peter had returned late from a meeting. He poured himself a drink, settling into his chair, and instinctively pulled up the security feed. Emily was in the living room sitting on the floor with Rose in her lap and Lily curled beside her. An open book rested on her knees, her voice soft as she traced each word with her finger, helping them sound it out. Lily, though still weak, was determined, her tiny hands gripping the edges of the book as she followed along. Rose, younger and more impatient, pouted in frustration when she got a word wrong. Emily just smiled, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. "Try again," she murmured. "It's okay to get things wrong. We learn by trying." Peter leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping idly against the desk. Most people, after suffering what she had suffered, would have been bitter. They would have focused on survival, on getting through the day. But she was still teaching them to grow. The third time, it was something that stayed with him. It had been a quiet evening. The girls had already gone to bed, and Emily was tucking them in. Peter switched between the different camera angles, watching as she smoothed the blankets over them, brushing a gentle hand across their hair. Just as she was about to turn off the lamp, Rose, barely awake, mumbled something. "Mama!" Emily paused, crouching beside the bed. "Hmm?" Rose's voice was sleepy, slurred, but her words were clear. "You're the strongest person in the world." Peter's breath stilled. Emily's face softened, and she let out a quiet chuckle, though there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. She pressed a hand against Rose's cheek, whispering, "Oh, baby, I don't know about that." Lily, eyes still closed, murmured from her side of the bed, "It's true." Peter swallowed, something foreign twisting in his chest. Emily didn't argue. She just kissed each of their foreheads, whispering a soft, "I love you," before switching off the light. Peter sat in silence, staring at the screen long after she had left the room. There was something about that moment, about them, that made his house feel different. Less empty, less cold. He didn't know what to do with that feeling. But he knew one thing. Emily wasn't just surviving. She was fighting. And somehow, despite everything, she was still winning. Peter Carter was a man of routine. Early mornings at the office, late nights spent in meetings or social events that weren't truly social, just business in disguise. His life was built on schedules, on efficiency, on never wasting time on things that didn't serve a purpose. For years, his mansion had been just that, a place of function, not warmth, a space filled with expensive furniture and exquisite art, but utterly devoid of life. But now something was changing. He felt it before he even understood it. It started with small things. One evening, as he stepped through the front door after a long day, he was greeted not by silence, but by the distant sound of laughter. Laughter. Not the polite, rehearsed kind he heard at corporate events, not the false flattery of people trying to gain his favor. No, this was different. It was real. Curious, he paused in the hallway, following the sound. In the living room, Emily sat cross-legged on the floor with Rose, playing some sort of clapping game. The little girl was giggling uncontrollably, clapping wildly, her eyes shining with joy. Lily, still recovering, lay curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over her legs, watching them with a sleepy smile. Emily turned at one point, shaking her head with mock exasperation. "You're cheating, Rose," she teased, poking her daughter's nose. Rose gasped dramatically. "I never cheat." Peter hadn't planned to stay and watch. But he did. He leaned against the door frame, unnoticed, his hands in his pockets, just observing. The way Emily smiled, not just at her children, but with them. The way the girls looked at her, as if she were their entire world. Something inside him stirred, a strange sensation. Nostalgia, maybe. Longing. But longing for what? He shook it off and went upstairs to his study, telling himself it was just a passing thought. Except the next day, he found himself coming home earlier than usual. And the next day. And the next. It was subtle at first. He started making excuses to be home. A contract that didn't need signing immediately. A meeting that could be postponed. For the first time in years, he skipped a corporate gala. Not because he was busy, he simply didn't feel like going. Instead, he found himself lingering in the house more. He would hear the girls playing, their tiny feet pattering down the halls. He would catch glimpses of Emily cooking in the kitchen, gently humming a song under her breath. One evening, as he walked into the dining room, he saw them gathered at the table. Emily helping Rose cut her food, Lily resting her head sleepily against her mother's arm. Without thinking, Peter hesitated. For years, he had eaten dinner alone or at business functions where conversation was just another form of negotiation. He had grown accustomed to silence, to efficiency. But looking at them now, the soft glow of the chandelier overhead, the quiet hum of conversation, the warmth in the air, it reminded him of something he had long forgotten, something that almost felt like family. That thought startled him. He wasn't the kind of man who longed for things he didn't have. Yet here he was, standing in his own home, realizing that for the first time in years, it didn't feel empty anymore. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that made Peter uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. He sat in his study, a book open in his lap, but he wasn't reading. His mind was elsewhere, drifting back to the past few weeks, to the sounds of laughter now filling his house, to the strange warmth that had begun to take root in the cold spaces he had once thought permanent. And then, a scream. A sharp, desperate sound that sliced through the silence like a knife. Emily. Peter was on his feet before he even realized he had moved. He sprinted down the hall, heart pounding, his instincts screaming something is wrong. As he burst into the guest room, the scene before him made his blood run cold. Emily was crouched on the floor, Lily in her arms, her tiny body convulsing, her face pale as a ghost, lips slightly blue. Emily's hands trembled as she cradled her daughter, her voice raw with panic. "Lily, Lily, stay with me, baby," she begged, desperation in every syllable. Rose stood nearby, frozen in fear, clutching her stuffed rabbit, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Peter didn't hesitate. He strode forward and scooped Lily into his arms, his pulse hammering at the way her body felt so limp, so fragile. Emily let out a choked sob but didn't stop him. She couldn't stop him. "We need to get to a hospital," Peter said, voice firm, controlled despite the chaos around him. Emily nodded frantically, stumbling to her feet as she grabbed Rose's hand. Peter didn't waste another second. He carried Lily through the mansion, down the stairs, and out into the night. The storm from days ago had long passed, but the air was too cold, too sharp, as if the world itself sensed the urgency in his steps. The car was already waiting. He barely registered the startled look on his driver's face as he barked, "Hospital! Now!" The engine roared to life, tires screeching against the pavement as they sped into the city. In the back seat, Emily clung to Lily's hand, whispering frantic prayers, tears streaking down her face. Peter had never believed in prayers, but as he looked down at the small, frail child in his arms, struggling for every breath, he found himself thinking, for the first time in his life, please, let her be okay. When they reached the hospital, he didn't wait for the car to fully stop. He threw the door open and rushed inside, Lily still cradled against his chest. "I need a doctor," he shouted, his deep voice booming through the emergency room. Within seconds, nurses and doctors swarmed around them, their movements swift and precise. A gurney appeared, hands reaching to take Lily, but for a brief moment, Peter hesitated, his arms instinctively tightening around her small frame. Then Emily's voice, broken, pleading. "Please, let them help her." Peter exhaled sharply and carefully placed Lily onto the gurney. Emily tried to follow, but a nurse gently stopped her. "Ma'am, we need space to work." "No, no, I have to be with her." Peter caught her just as she nearly collapsed from panic. He turned to the nurse, his voice sharp, uncompromising. "Let her in." One look at his expression, and they didn't argue. Emily was ushered inside, disappearing down the hall with Lily, leaving Peter standing there, feeling something he wasn't used to feeling. Helpless. For the first time in his life, his money, his power, his influence, none of it could fix this. All he could do was wait, and he hated it. The hospital room was eerily quiet. Machines beeped steadily, a rhythmic reminder that Lily was still fighting. The dim glow of the monitors cast soft shadows across her frail body, her small chest rising and falling with each measured breath. Emily sat beside the bed, her fingers gently brushing over Lily's hand, careful not to disturb the IV taped to her delicate skin. She should have felt relieved. The doctors had stabilized her daughter. They had said she would recover. She would be okay. But the relief didn't come. Instead, a wave of something heavier, something darker settled in her chest. Guilt. She had failed. She had tried so hard, had fought with everything she had left, and it still hadn't been enough. If Peter hadn't been there, if he hadn't acted so quickly, if he hadn't saved them. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, swallowing the lump in her throat. She hated this feeling. She hated the way gratitude mixed with shame, the way relief clashed with fear. Because this wasn't just about Lily. It was about her. She had let someone help. She had let someone step in when she couldn't do it alone. And that terrified her. For so long, she had taught herself to rely on no one. She had learned that help always came with a cost. That kindness was often temporary. That people only stayed until it was no longer convenient. But Peter had stepped in, and he hadn't asked for anything in return. That should have made her feel safe. Instead, it made her feel trapped, because now she owed him, and she didn't know how to live with that. She couldn't stay in his world. Not like this. This wasn't their life. It wasn't supposed to be. Lily stirred slightly in the bed, and Emily immediately leaned forward, brushing damp strands of hair from her daughter's forehead. She had to be stronger than this. She couldn't let herself get comfortable. She couldn't let herself depend on him. Because one day Peter Carter would wake up and realize that they didn't belong in his perfect, structured world. And Emily refused to wait around for the moment when he decided to walk away. She had survived once. She would survive again, even if it meant leaving before she lost herself in the warmth he had given them. Emily barely had time to process her emotions before he walked in. The hospital room had been quiet. Lily was still resting, Rose curled up in the chair beside her, and Emily was lost in her own thoughts when the door creaked open. She turned, expecting to see a nurse, maybe Peter. Instead, her breath caught in her throat. Lucas. For a moment, she thought she was hallucinating, that maybe exhaustion and stress had finally broken her mind. But no, he was real. He stood in the doorway, a practiced, sorrowful expression on his face. He looked different from the last time she had seen him, but only in ways that mattered to him. His clothes were newer, cleaner. His hair was styled, his beard neatly trimmed, but his eyes were the same shade of cold calculation hidden beneath a mask of charm. Emily, he breathed, taking a slow step inside. His voice was soft, familiar, too familiar. I had to come. I just found out about Lily, about everything. Emily's body tensed, her fingers curled into her sleeves, instinctively placing herself between him and the bed where Lily lay. He shouldn't be here. How had he even found them? What are you doing here, Lucas? She asked, her voice wary. Lucas exhaled, running a hand through his hair in a performance of frustration. I know, I messed up. I left and I should have never done that. He took another step closer. But I want to fix things. I want to bring you and the girls home. Home. The word felt foreign coming from his lips. Emily's chest tightened, old wounds threatening to reopen. Because she remembered what home had meant when Lucas was in it. Lies, betrayal, the slow unraveling of trust until there was nothing left. Her silence made him press further. Listen, I've changed. I've thought about you and the girls every single day since I left. I made a mistake, Emily, but I want to make it right. Let me take care of you. Let me take them home. Emily swallowed hard, her mind at war with itself. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that he had no right to come back now, that he had left them to rot while he built a new life for himself. But then she looked at Lily, at Rose. They needed stability, security, and no matter how much she hated Lucas for what he had done, there was a small, nagging voice in the back of her mind whispering, would they be better off with him? Could he really have changed? The doubt crept in, and Lucas saw it. His lips curled slightly, sensing her hesitation. But before he could push further, A deep voice cut through the air. Interesting. I don't recall anyone inviting you here. Lucas stiffened. Emily turned just in time to see Peter standing in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. His gaze flickered between them, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly at Lucas before landing on Emily. Assessing, calculating. Lucas regained his composure quickly, offering a practiced smile. And you are? Peter didn't answer right away. He took his time, stepping fully into the room, his presence alone shifting the atmosphere. Calm, controlled, but laced with something dangerous underneath. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth, measured. I'm the man paying for your daughter's hospital bills, he said simply, and the man who doesn't trust a word coming out of your mouth. Lucas's expression faltered for a fraction of a second, but he covered it quickly with a chuckle. Look, I don't want trouble. I just want my family back. Peter tilted his head slightly, watching him. Then he pulled out his phone. If that's the case, he said, tapping the screen, you won't mind if I run a background check on you. Lucas's easygoing demeanor cracked. It was brief, barely a flicker, but Peter caught it. And in that instant, he knew. Something wasn't right. Something about Lucas didn't add up. And Peter Carter wasn't a man who ignored his instincts. Peter didn't waste time. The moment Lucas left the hospital, Peter was already making calls. He had built his empire on precision, on knowing everything about the people he dealt with before they even knew he existed. A man like Lucas? He wasn't difficult to uncover. Within hours, the results came in, the truth about Lucas. Peter sat in the back of his car, scrolling through the file his investigator had sent him. Each line of text made his jaw tighten further. Lucas had debts, a lot of them. Gambling, unpaid loans, a trail of failed investments, and creditors breathing down his neck. He hadn't come back for Emily. He had come back because he needed money. Peter's grip on his phone tightened. He had seen men like Lucas before. Leeches, parasites who only returned when they needed something. The kind of men who left people like Emily behind to suffer, only to show up when it suited them. And the worst part? Emily had almost believed him. That thought alone made Peter's stomach twist in a way he wasn't used to. His driver pulled up to the hospital just as his phone buzzed with a message from his investigator. Lucas has been inquiring about Emily's financial situation. He's aware she's staying with you. Peter let out a slow, controlled breath. Of course he is. The bastard had always been after money. Peter stepped out of the car, slipping his phone into his coat pocket, his expression unreadable. But inside, he was already planning his next move. The confrontation. When Peter walked into Lily's hospital room, Emily was sitting by her daughter's bedside, brushing a gentle hand over Lily's hair. She looked tired, worn, and completely unaware of what was coming. She glanced up at him as he entered. "Hey," she said softly. "Everything okay?" Peter didn't answer immediately. He studied her for a moment, the quiet strength in her eyes, the resilience she had carried alone for so long. Then in a low, measured voice, he said, "Lucas is lying to you." Emily froze. "What?" she breathed. Peter stepped closer, keeping his tone controlled. "He doesn't want you back. He doesn't want the girls. He wants money." Emily shook her head slightly as if trying to process his words. "How do you know that?" Peter pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward her. "Because I had him investigated." Emily's eyes widened as she scanned the screen. The words blurred together, but she could make out enough. The debts, the gambling, the financial ruin. Her stomach twisted violently. "He's in trouble," Peter continued, his voice steady, "and he sees you as his way out." Emily swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the edge of the hospital bed. How could she have been so blind? Lucas had always been selfish, but this, using their daughters as leverage for money? Her pulse pounded in her ears. Before she could find the words, the door swung open. Lucas, his gaze flicked between them, his smile tight, forced. "Well," he drawled, stepping inside. "That didn't take long, did it?" Peter turned to face him, fully, his stance casual, but his eyes sharp. dangerous. Lucas's smirk didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let me guess," he said, shoving his hands into his pockets. "You had me checked out, Mr. Moneybags?" Peter didn't answer. He didn't need to. Lucas exhaled dramatically, shaking his head. "Look, Emily, I get it. I messed up. But what's wrong with a man trying to get back on his feet, trying to get back his family?" Emily stood slowly, her hands clenched at her sides. "Don't," Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Don't what?" "Don't act like you ever wanted us back," she snapped, her voice shaking with anger. "You left us with nothing, and now you think you can just walk back in when it's convenient for you?" Lucas's easygoing expression faltered. For a split second, something ugly flashed in his eyes. Then he smirked again. "All right," he said, his voice turning cold. "Since we're being honest, yeah, I need money. So what? You've been living in a goddamn mansion, eating off this guy's generosity? What, you're too good to help out your own husband?" "You're not my husband," Emily spat. Lucas's jaw ticked. Then he tilted his head toward Peter, a cruel glint in his gaze. "Right, I forgot. You found a new rich guy to take care of you." Peter's fingers twitched. He didn't react, didn't move, but his patience was razor thin. Lucas took another step forward, lowering his voice. "Here's the deal, sweetheart. Either you help me out, or I go to court and file for custody." Emily's stomach dropped. "You wouldn't." "Oh, I would," Lucas interrupted smoothly. "Judges love a rich, stable father over a single mother with no job. Imagine how that'll look, huh? You bouncing between shelters while I provide a better life for them?" Emily's breath caught. He was bluffing. He had to be bluffing. But the sheer confidence in his voice made her knees weaken. Lucas had abandoned them. He didn't love their daughters. But in the eyes of the law, money talked, and Lucas knew exactly how to use it. She felt her world crumbling, panic clawing at her chest. Then, a quiet, deadly voice cut through the tension. "I'd rethink that." Emily turned, startled. Peter had stepped forward, his presence suddenly suffocating. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't threatening, but the weight behind his words sent a cold chill through the room. Lucas opened his mouth, but Peter continued, calmly, decisively. "You're broke, Lucas. You have no job, no home, and no assets. Do you really think a judge is going to hand over 2 children to a man who can't even pay his own debts?" Lucas's smug confidence wavered. Peter tilted his head slightly, his voice dropping to something colder, darker. "Or," he added, "do you want me to dig deeper?" "Because I will. And I guarantee I'll find something that makes sure you never get within 50 feet of them again." Silence. Lucas's fingers twitched. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew he had just lost. His lips curled in frustration, but he forced a chuckle. "Tch, whatever. She's not worth the trouble anyway." Emily flinched, but Peter took a step forward, blocking Lucas's view of her. "You have 10 seconds to walk out of this hospital," Peter said smoothly, "or I'll have security drag you out." Lucas's jaw clenched. Then after a long, tense moment, he scoffed. "This isn't over." And with that, he turned on his heel and stalked out the door. Emily felt her knees go weak. Peter didn't say anything for a long moment. He simply exhaled, adjusting his cuffs as if nothing had happened. Then, without looking at her, he said, "You don't have to be afraid of him anymore." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. For the first time in a long time, she believed it. The hospital room was still, but the air between them was charged, tense, suffocating. Emily stood near the bed, arms crossed, her body rigid. Anger simmered just beneath the surface. Peter, on the other hand, remained calm. Too calm. That was what infuriated her the most. "You had no right," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Peter exhaled slowly, slipping his hands into his pockets. Controlled, unshaken. "I had every right," he countered. "Lucas was a threat. You don't get to decide that for me," Emily snapped, stepping forward, her hands curled into fists at her sides. "You think just because you have money, because you can make a few calls, you get to play God with my life?" Peter's jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained unreadable. "I did what needed to be done." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "No, You did what you thought was best, without asking me, without even considering what I wanted. Peter narrowed his eyes, his patience thinning. And what would you have done, Emily? Let him manipulate you? Let him threaten you into giving him money you don't have? I don't know, she admitted, her voice rising. But that should have been my decision, not yours. Peter took a step forward now, his presence imposing. And if your decision put you and your daughters at risk, his voice dropped lower, sharper. Would you still be standing here defending your independence when Lucas came back with lawyers? When he dragged you through court and took your girls from you? Emily flinched. He saw it, the way her eyes flashed with fear, the way her breath hitched, just for a second. But then just as quickly, her anger reignited. This isn't about Lucas, she snapped. This is about you thinking you can just fix me. Peter's expression darkened, but before he could speak, she shook her head, her voice quieter now. Weary. I don't need saving, Peter. For a long moment, neither of them moved. A thick silence stretched between them, filled with words neither dared to say. Then Emily swallowed hard and took a step back. I think we should leave. Peter's entire body went still. His fingers twitched, a small, barely noticeable reaction, but she caught it. You're being irrational. His voice was clipped now, controlled but not indifferent. No, she whispered, shaking her head. I'm just choosing for myself. Peter exhaled sharply, tilting his head as he studied her. So that's it? You're going to walk out because I did what you couldn't? Emily's eyes burned. Because you didn't let me try. Peter opened his mouth, but for the first time he had no response. Because he realized this wasn't about Lucas anymore. This was about her. Emily had spent so long fighting to stand on her own 2 feet, to not rely on anyone, that the moment someone took control, even to help her, it felt like a cage. And for all his intelligence, for all his ability to read people, Peter hadn't seen it until now. Emily turned toward Lily, brushing her fingers through her daughter's hair one last time before straightening. She didn't say another word. She didn't have to. She had already made up her mind. Then, without looking back, she walked out. Peter felt something he wasn't used to. Loss. He stood in the empty hospital room staring at the door that Emily had walked through just moments ago. She was gone. The air still carried traces of her presence, the faint scent of lavender from her worn-out sweater, the lingering warmth of the argument they had just had. But now there was nothing left except silence. Peter clenched his jaw, running a hand through his hair. Why did this bother him so much? He had given her everything, a place to stay, safety, protection. He had fought for her children, when no one else would. And yet she had walked away. No, not just walked away. She had chosen to leave. That realization sat heavy in his chest in a way he couldn't quite explain. People didn't leave Peter Carter. He was the one who dictated when relationships ended, the one who controlled the terms. But this felt different. This felt personal. And the worst part? He didn't know how to fix it. For Emily, leaving meant survival, but this time it felt like defeat. The cold was sharper than she remembered. Emily pulled Lily's coat tighter around her daughter's small frame as she sat on the edge of a park bench, trying to ignore the way the wind cut through her own thin clothes like a knife. They had nowhere to go. Again. The small amount of cash she had managed to gather was barely enough for food. The shelters were full, and even if there had been space, she refused to bring her daughters back into that world. Lily was still weak, her body exhausted from the hospital stay. Rose, though too young to fully understand what was happening, could sense the weight in her mother's shoulders, in her quiet, forced smiles. Emily had been here before, but somehow this time felt harder. Maybe because she had tasted what it was like to be safe, even if just for a little while. Maybe because for the first time in a long time, she had allowed herself to trust someone, and she had ruined it. She had looked into Peter's eyes and seen something no one had ever given her before, unwavering certainty, and she had walked away from it. Because what if he changed his mind? What if, like Lucas, he decided she wasn't worth it? Emily had spent too many nights teaching herself that depending on someone meant giving them the power to hurt you. So she had left first. But now, as she looked down at her daughters, Rose curled into her side, Lily barely staying awake through her fatigue, she wondered if she had made the wrong choice. Because this time, she wasn't the only one suffering for it. The night was colder than before. Emily could feel it in her bones, in the way her fingers trembled as she tucked the thin blanket tighter around Lily. They had been staying in an abandoned building for the past 2 nights, a temporary shelter, barely enough to keep them out of the biting wind. Lily had been quiet all day, too quiet. Her small body was hot against Emily's side, her breath shallow, her tiny fingers clutching weakly at the fabric of her mother's coat. Emily pressed a hand to her daughter's forehead and her stomach twisted. Too warm, too weak. A sickening sense of déjà vu filled her chest. This was happening again, and this time there was no Peter to help. Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, stroking Lily's damp hair. "I've got you." Lily stirred slightly, her lashes fluttering. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but only a faint murmur came out. Then in a voice so small, so fragile, she whispered, "Peter?" Emily's heart stopped. She stared at her daughter, a lump forming in her throat, thick and unbearable. Lily wasn't calling for her. She was calling for him, for the man Emily had pushed away, for the man she had convinced herself they didn't need. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in sharp, uneven pulls. She had told herself she was doing the right thing, that she was protecting herself, her daughters, that she was choosing strength, independence. But now her daughter was lying in her arms, burning with fever, her body too weak to fight back. And the only name she could whisper in her delirium was his. Emily's vision blurred. She had been wrong. She had been so wrong. A sob tore through her throat as she pulled Lily closer, pressing desperate kisses to her forehead. She needed help, and she knew exactly where to find it. Tears streaming down her face, Emily grabbed her bag, wrapped Lily in the blanket, and ran. The moment Emily realized she couldn't do this alone, Emily burst through the hospital doors, gasping for breath, her arms tightening around Lily's frail body. The nurses at the front desk barely had time to react before Emily's panicked voice cut through the sterile air. "Please, my daughter, she can't breathe." A team of doctors rushed forward, guiding Emily toward a stretcher as she clung desperately to Lily, refusing to let go. "Ma'am, we need to take her now." Emily hesitated, her body trembling, but then she saw Lily's face, her small lips parted, her breath barely there, and she let go. The doctors whisked her away, disappearing behind the double doors, leaving Emily standing there, cold and hollow. Her legs gave out, and she sank into the nearest chair, burying her face in her hands. Then a deep, urgent voice echoed through the hall. "Where is she?" Emily's breath caught. She knew that voice. Peter. She looked up just as he stormed through the hospital entrance, his coat unbuttoned, his eyes sharp and frantic. His gaze immediately landed on her. And something inside him changed. She looked small, curled into herself, her body racked with exhaustion. Her face was pale, tear-streaked, haunted. Peter had never seen her like this. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, he was there, kneeling in front of her. What happened? His voice was low, controlled, but his eyes betrayed him. He was afraid. Emily sucked in a shaky breath. She got worse. I didn't have anywhere to take her. I didn't." Her voice broke. Peter clenched his jaw. He took her hands, his grip firm, steadying. "I've got her now," he said. Emily shook her head. "Peter, But before she could finish, his hands framed her face, his thumbs brushing against her damp cheeks. "Listen to me," he said, his voice quieter now. "I'm not helping because I pity you." Her breath caught. Peter's grip tightened just slightly, as if he needed her to hear every word. "I'm here because I want to be," he said. "Because I want you here. I want you with me." Emily's lips parted, but no words came out. Because what could she possibly say? She had spent her whole life being left. But now here was this man, this impossible, infuriating, stubborn man who refused to let her go. She didn't realize she was crying again until Peter pressed his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "Let me help you," he murmured, and this time she didn't push him away. The hospital was quiet now. Lily was stable, her breathing steady, her tiny frame rising and falling peacefully under the blankets. Rose had curled up beside her, her small hand resting protectively over her sister's. Emily sat by the hospital bed, but this time she wasn't alone. Peter stood near the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the city lights. His posture was relaxed, but Emily could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of something unsaid lingering between them. She had never seen him like this before. For the first time since she had met him, he looked tired. Not physically, but in a way that went deeper than exhaustion. A weariness carved into his very being. She hesitated before speaking. "Peter," she said softly. He didn't turn immediately, but when he did, his expression was unreadable. Like a man who had spent years bearing his own past so deep, he almost forgot it existed. Almost. Emily studied him for a long moment. Then quietly she asked, "Why did you help me?" Peter exhaled slowly. He walked over to the empty chair beside her and sat down, resting his elbows on his knees. He didn't look at her when he answered. "Because I know what it's like to watch someone suffer and not be able to do a damn thing about it." Emily frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Peter leaned back, running a hand through his hair. His gaze remained distant, as if he were staring at something only he could see. "My mother," he said after a pause. "She was strong, the strongest person I've ever known." Emily stayed silent, sensing that this wasn't something he talked about often. Peter let out a short, humorless chuckle. "My father didn't see it that way. He saw her as a burden. A woman who wasn't good enough for him, who wasn't worth sticking around for. So one day he left." Emily's stomach tightened. Peter exhaled, shaking his head slightly. He didn't even look back, just walked out and started over. A new family, a new life, like we never existed. His voice was calm, matter of fact, but Emily could hear the resentment buried beneath the words. "My mother didn't complain," he continued. "She didn't beg him to stay. She just kept going. Worked herself to the bone to make sure I had food, a roof over my head. She never asked for help, even when she needed it." Emily's breath caught slightly at those words, because suddenly she understood. Peter had seen her, had seen the way she fought, the way she sacrificed, the way she never let herself break. And he had seen his mother in her. "You remind me of her," he admitted, finally looking at her. "And I couldn't just stand by and watch you struggle the way she did." Emily's throat tightened. She had spent so much of her life believing that needing help made her weak, that accepting kindness meant owing something in return. But Peter hadn't helped her because he expected anything. He had helped because he knew what it was like to be left behind, just like her. Emily swallowed hard. "She must have been an incredible woman." Peter's lips twitched slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close. "She was." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then Emily did something she never thought she would. She reached over and took his hand. Peter stiffened slightly, surprised, but he didn't pull away. For the first time since they met, there was no tension, no walls between them. Just two people who had spent their lives learning how to survive, finally realizing they didn't have to do it alone. The day Lily was discharged from the hospital, the world felt different, lighter, warmer. Emily stepped out into the fresh air, Lily's small hand curled tightly in hers, Rose skipping happily at her side. The weight she'd been carrying for so long, the fear, the loneliness, the doubt, felt just a little less heavy. And standing there waiting for them was Peter. He had insisted on driving them home. And though Emily had hesitated, something in the way he had looked at her, the quiet patience, the unwavering presence, made her nod without protest. They drove in comfortable silence, the city passing by outside, but Emily felt a strange certainty settle in her chest. This time, she wasn't walking away. This time, she was choosing to stay. The proposal that wasn't about diamonds or wealth, but something deeper that evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Emily stepped outside onto the balcony of Peter's mansion. The city lights stretched out below, flickering like stars against the skyline. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain that had passed earlier in the day. She wasn't surprised when she heard Peter's footsteps behind her. "I figured you'd be out here," he said, leaning against the railing beside her. Emily exhaled softly. Needed some air. They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable, but full. Then Peter reached into his pocket. Emily turned slightly, watching as he pulled out something small, something old. A delicate silver necklace, slightly worn with age, its chain thin but strong. Emily blinked, confused. "What is that?" Peter exhaled, running his thumb over the pendant before looking at her. Really looking at her. "This belonged to my mother," he said quietly. "She wore it every day, until the day she died." Emily's breath caught. Peter hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. Then, in a voice steadier than she had ever heard before, he said, "I don't have a ring, Emily." Her chest tightened. "But I have this." He took a step closer, the space between them disappearing. "I spent most of my life believing that love wasn't worth it, that people always left, that it was better not to trust. And then you showed up." His fingers curled around the necklace as he spoke, his voice quieter now. "You changed everything." Emily couldn't breathe. "So no," he shook his head slightly. "I don't have a diamond ring. But I have this, and if you take it, it means you trust me. It means you believe that I'm not going anywhere." A lump formed in Emily's throat, because this wasn't just a proposal. This was Peter Carter, the man who never let anyone in, giving her the last piece of himself, his past, his trust, his love. Tears burned in her eyes, but she smiled, a real, genuine smile, as she reached forward, her fingers brushing against his. "I don't need a ring, Peter." She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just need you." Peter let out a breath, almost as if he had been holding it. Then slowly he fastened the necklace around her neck. When his hands dropped, she didn't hesitate. She leaned forward and pressed her lips softly against his. A promise, a beginning, a home. And for the first time in his life, Peter Carter knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the park. The gentle rustling of leaves and the distant laughter of children filled the air, mixing with the soft hum of life moving peacefully around them. Emily walked beside Peter along the winding path, their fingers loosely intertwined. Ahead of them, Lily and Rose ran ahead, their giggles carrying through the breeze. Lily, still a little frail but full of life, turned around and grinned up at Peter. She reached for his hand, small, delicate, but strong in its own way. Peter hesitated for only a second before taking it. Lily squeezed his fingers and looked up at him, her wide, innocent eyes filled with something Peter had never seen directed at him before. Trust. Belonging. Then in the softest voice she whispered, "Now I have a real daddy." Peter froze. Something deep in his chest tightened. A feeling so foreign yet so powerful, it nearly knocked the air from his lungs. Emily turned to look at him, tears shimmering in her eyes. Peter swallowed hard, his grip on Lily's hand tightening ever so slightly. He had built his life on logic, control, power. But this moment, this tiny, fragile, perfect moment, was something he never could have planned for. His throat tightened, but he managed a small, genuine smile. "Yeah," he murmured, giving Lily's hand a squeeze. "You do." Rose giggled and grabbed his other hand, swinging between him and Emily. "And me too," Peter chuckled, his deep, rare laughter blending with theirs. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't just existing. He was living. He was home,